Welcome, everyone, to this library talk, one in a continuing series of opportunities to gather as friends of the Library of the Church of the Holy Faith and to showcase some of the wonderful resources that the Holy Faith Library has, as well as highlighting some of our extraordinary parishioners who have contributed to the resources that the Holy Faith Library has. And so today, brought to you by the Library Committee, is this library talk featuring Kent Grubbs, who is going to talk to us about his pilgrimage on the Camino de Santiago de Compostela in Spain, a pilgrimage that he's taken a few years ago, and one that he's captured in a wonderful book. And let me get and show that to you. I happen to have a copy here that looks like this. And the title is Each Day We Take to the Road, Walking the Camino de Santiago. And Kent has graciously gifted a copy of this book to the library, and it's in the library for you to peruse at your leisure. And would encourage you to come into the library with its now new comfortable chairs and sit a spell and enjoy the ambience and enjoy the wonderful resources that the library provides. I think I will stop there and just turn the program over to Kent. We'll have a presentation that Kent will walk us through his own walk on the Camino, and then we will have an opportunity for questions and answers at the end of the time. Kent, take it away.
Thank you so much, Father Robin. Let me pull up my presentation. There we go. Can everybody see that? Good. Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for joining us. For those of you who may have seen my talk a few months ago about our pilgrimage to the Holy Land, today I offer a different type of pilgrimage experience, less focused on scripture perhaps, but spiritual nonetheless. Certainly more physically demanding, but still an inward journey as well. And what a journey it is. It's one that's been made by millions of pilgrims since the 9th century, long before the Crusaders set off for the Holy Land. The mystery begins with St. James, son of Zebedee, one of the 12 apostles. After Jesus' crucifixion, James evangelized throughout Judea and Samaria, but the legend of Santiago says that James's ministry took him much further afield, specifically to the Iberian Peninsula, where he preached and where the Virgin Mary appeared to him on the banks of the Ebro River. After seeing this vision, he returned to Jerusalem. We're told in Acts 12 that James was executed by King Herod Agrippa roughly 10 years after Jesus' crucifixion, but according to the Santiago tradition, his two faithful Iberian companions, Atanasio and Teodoro, retrieved James's body and returned it to Galicia in northwestern Spain, where it was interred in a cave. Early in the 9th century, a hermit living in the area saw a strange and holy light emanating from a cave, and upon inspection, he found 3 skeletons. Word of this miracle reached King Alfonso II of Asturias, who in 814 made the trip himself to see this extraordinary sight, becoming the first pilgrim in the process. Declaring the remains to be those of James and his 2 companions, Alfonso ordered a chapel to be built on the spot, the beginning of Santiago de Compostela, Santiago being a Galician derivative of the Latin term for St. James, and Compostela, in the theory that I prefer, deriving from the Latin for field of stars, a reference to the mysterious light seen at the cave. The current Cathedral of Santiago, which dates from 1075, rests on this spot, and it contains a crypt under the altar where the three skeletons are held in a reliquary. This marks the final destination for pilgrims following what has become to be known as the Way of St. James, or more colloquially, the Camino de Santiago. About 300,000 people make this pilgrimage in a typical year. So what I'd like to do today is to take you on that pilgrimage journey based on our experience. My wife, Kaki, and I traveled to Spain in May of 2016, which was a wonderful time of year to make this journey, as you'll see. We were joined by 6 other pilgrims, our 2 outstanding guides, Eric and Leo, their charming assistant, Emma, and our able driver, Javier. It was a small group, which led to rapid bonding as we walked together. There are actually several pilgrimage routes to Santiago, but the most famous is the French route, beginning on the northern slopes of the Pyrenees Mountains and continuing for about 500 miles across northern Spain. The route begins in the small French town of Saint-Jean-Pied-de-Port, shown by the yellow arrow, and it concludes at Santiago, shown by the orange arrow. And to walk the entire distance, as many people do, it typically takes 4 to 6 weeks or even longer at a more leisurely pace. And in fact, our fellow parishioner, Eric Springstead, who's joining us today on this call, has done just that. And at the end of my comments, I would invite Eric to provide his reflections as well. There's a well-organized system of hostels called Refugios, where pilgrims can stop for the night, complete with multiple bunk beds and communal bathrooms. Another strategy that pilgrims adopt is to walk the last 60 miles into Santiago, a less taxing alternative for sure, and one that still qualifies for an official pilgrim's certificate called a Compostela, shown here. At our stage in life, however, we are beyond both certificates of achievement and communal bathrooms. So what we did was to walk 96 of the most interesting miles in 8 consecutive days, averaging about 12 miles a day. The parts of the Camino that we walked are shown by the red segments in the larger map. So we covered about 1/5 of the Camino on foot and traveled the remainder by coach. This had the advantage of allowing us to see the countryside along the entire route while avoiding the less interesting pedestrian stretches, such as going through some of the larger cities, and doing it all in a little over a week. During the pilgrimage, I kept a journal reflecting my impressions for the day, and what I'd like to do today is to describe our experience mostly through my journal entries. I'll frame each day for you at the beginning, and then I'll let my journal tell you what happened. Kaki and I also started each day with morning prayer, using liturgy from a pilgrimage trip we had taken to Ireland the previous year, and I'll include a passage from our morning prayer at the start of each day. But before we begin, there are a couple of things which are essential to a Camino pilgrimage that I need to explain. When our pilgrimage group began to gather in Bilbao, Spain, we were each given a white scallop shell with a red cross of St. James painted on it, like the one that's shown here, to attach to our backpacks to signify that we were Camino pilgrims. In fact, all along the Camino route, the scallop symbol is used to mark the trail, often accompanied by a yellow arrow. The origin of this tradition is nebulous. Some explanations invoke a spiritual element and others offer a more prosaic explanation. But whatever the origin, the symbol is ubiquitous, and we each dutifully attached our shell to our backpacks. The second essential item we were provided was a Credencial del Peregrino, essentially a passport booklet that got stamped at various locations as we progressed on our journey to verify where we had been. This was something that was taken pretty seriously by everyone, by us pilgrims, because we wanted to collect all of these stamps to which we were entitled, and also by those who issued the stamps. They didn't give those stamps out to just anyone. And one final thing I'll add here to set the scene before we begin is the chorus of an old French Pilgrim song that I ran across while preparing for our journey. Each day we take to the road. Each day we forge ahead. Day after day, the route calls us. It is the voice of Compostela. And with that blessing, let's begin our journey. Saint Jean-Pied-de-Port. The world belongs to God, the earth, and all its people. As I mentioned, we met our fellow pilgrims in Bilbao, then traveled by coach to Saint Jean. My journal reads, after another hour's drive, we crossed into France and headed on to our destination for the night, Saint Jean-Pied-de-Port. Translated literally as Saint John at the foot of the pass, Saint John has been standing guard over a high mountain pass through the Pyrenees to Spain for centuries, and thus has always held strategic significance. Today, it forms the starting point for the French route of the Camino de Santiago. Saint John was a lovely town of whitewashed buildings with red trim and terracotta roofs, and we strolled through the hilly old town to get the first stamps in our credenzials. Courteous but sober-looking men examined our real passports and watched carefully as we filled in our identity details in our credenzials before affixing the first official stamp. After a leisurely dinner with excellent food and pleasant conversation, I walked across the street and back into the old town to stretch my legs before turning in. It was 10:20 or so, and there were at least a dozen other pilgrims with full backpacks walking up and down the main drag, looking for accommodation. As I stood at an intersection, two young men toting backpacks approached me. They looked tired, but excited too. One of them asked me in broken French whether I could help him with directions. He had a printed reservation from booking.com, and he was looking for his bed for the night. When I replied in my American English, well, I'm a stranger here myself, he laughed good-naturedly, and I could tell that they were Americans too. They headed off down the street, continuing their quest, and I thought to myself, I haven't set one foot on the Camino yet, and people are asking me for directions. Maybe it was a good sign. Day 1. We will not offer to God offerings that cost us nothing. Our first day on the Camino began above St. John, where a shrine to the Virgin Mary watches over pilgrims as they begin their journey. The route would take us over the Pyrenees and down into the lovely and historic Spanish village of Roncesvalles. The journal continues. Take a deep breath. One foot in front of the other. The longest journey begins with a single step. That's one small step for man. Yeah, that's going too far. I was trying to think of all of the appropriate motivational expressions when you're about to embark on a challenging endeavor as we took our first steps on the Camino de Santiago. It was 10:30 in the morning, and we had been whisked effortlessly up the first 6 miles of the trail, a single-track asphalt lane, from St. John in small vans. We must have passed 200 pilgrims along the way, a steady climb from town into the heart of the Pyrenees. Cloud cover had kept the temperatures down. It was probably in the low 50s with a light, refreshing breeze, and it was dry. After the obligatory group photo, we joined the other pilgrims in the climb upward. After a while, we left the tarmac and headed down a well-trod earth track, which eventually led into a lovely forest of beech trees, bursting with fresh springtime green foliage. Emerging from the forest briefly, we reached a spring where pilgrims were filling their water bottles, and crossing a cattle guard in the trail, suddenly we were back in Spain. Visibility improved as the sky brightened up, revealing, if you looked carefully, snow-covered peaks of the high Pyrenees in the distance. The trail was well marked either by freestanding signposts with the Camino shell symbol or by a simple arrow painted in yellow on a rock, signs that we would see repeatedly for the next 8 days. After traversing this high alpine terrain, we reached the summit of our pass, the highest point that we would reach on the Camino at nearly 4,700 feet, offering wonderful views of the countryside to the south. After a leisurely picnic lunch, we plunged back into a beech forest, heading downhill to Roncesvalles. The forest nearly resembled a manicured garden. There was virtually no undergrowth, as the forest floor seemed carpeted with a thick mulch of dead leaves. Beech trunks shot straight up 50 feet or more, providing a high green canopy, and dappled sunlight filtered through to the mostly shady path. But much of the trail was fairly steep, heading straight down with no switchbacks to ease the descent, and this took a toll on our knees and calves. Finally, though, the slope diminished, and suddenly we were in Roncesvalles. It was only 2:45, and we had covered nearly 10 miles in only 3 hours and 45 minutes of walking time. We queued up with several dozen other pilgrims to get our credenzials stamped, and then, under sunny skies, checked into our very pleasant room at the Hotel Roncesvalles. The efficient Emma and Javier had already delivered our bags. Roncesvalles is famous as the site of the Battle of Roncesvalles Pass in 778, where Charlemagne's rear guard, led by Roland, was defeated by Basque tribesmen, immortalized in the oldest extant piece of French literature, the Song of Roland. In the late 12th century, a hospital and collegiate church were erected by King Sancho VII, who's buried here, to assist pilgrims making the journey to Santiago. Extremely pastoral and impossibly picturesque, Roncesvalles seemed more like a collection of beautifully restored religious buildings than a town. After a welcome rest, we met for a tour. Our perky guide, Mercedes, started us off in the local museum, which was opened up just for our group. It was a large single room with religious artifacts and paintings from the 12th through 16th centuries, which Mercedes explained to us. But suddenly, Khaki tugged at my elbow and brought me over to a case that Mercedes had not yet gotten to, and I was stunned by what I saw. Elegantly displayed in a glass case was an original volume of Civitatis Orbis Terrarum by the Cologne mapmakers Braun and Hogenberg, opened to their splendid map of Venice. First appearing in 1572, the Civitatis was the first atlas ever published dedicated to city maps. And while I had seen individual maps from it, in fact, I own one, I had never seen an intact volume before. I informed Mercedes that I knew something about old maps and gave her a brief description of the significance of the Civitatis. I was truly amazed to find such a significant, intact, and valuable volume tucked away in this tiny hamlet at the foot of the Pyrenees, and Mercedes seemed keen to learn more about it. After visiting the wonderful 13th century Gothic cathedral, Mercedes kindly led me back into the museum through a refugio full of smelly pilgrims, where I gazed again at the lovely atlas. And in appreciation, I told Mercedes that I would send her links to some websites where she could learn more about it. At 8 p.m., we hurried back to the cathedral for the daily Pilgrims Mass. It was fairly packed with pilgrims from all over, from 27 countries and 9 Spanish provinces to be precise, as a priest read a list of all the nationalities represented that night in Roncesvalles, gleaned from the day's issuance of credenzial stamps. 3 priests led the Mass in the lovely cathedral, and Mercedes gave a scripture reading from James. At the conclusion, however, we were all beckoned to the altar rail, where the officiant gave a blessing to all pilgrims, and then, With the lights dimmed, he led the congregation in an a cappella rendition of a hymn which I later learned was the Salve Regina, and which most of the congregation seemed to know by heart. Listening to the soft voices in the ancient and faintly lit cathedral was quite moving, as you can imagine. We were all reminded of our purpose and of the centuries of pilgrims who had preceded us to Santiago. Following the service, as people were filing out, Mercedes found me, and as a souvenir token, she gave me the list of countries that the officiant had read during the Mass. What a touching gesture that was. Day 2. How good it is, how wonderful to live together in unity. Today we covered a longer stretch, 14 miles, leading mostly downhill through small towns and pleasant countryside. After our day's walk, we were then taken by coach to Pamplona. The journal continues. It was cool and bright as we left Roncesvalles on foot at 8:30. I had not slept well, though, despite the near-perfect sleeping conditions in our very comfortable room, and even the bright blue sky struggled to lift my spirits as I trudged off down the path. Almost immediately, we plunged into a thick forest, dark in the early morning light, and quite different from the majestic beech forests of yesterday. Lots of undergrowth gave a closed-in feeling, and when Leo mentioned that the forest was associated in previous centuries with witches, it only added to my gloom. After a few miles, though, we emerged from the forest and entered the quiet and charming Basque town of Burgos, still seemingly half asleep. Apparently, Ernest Hemingway had stayed in Burgos several times in the 1920s to fish while vacationing in nearby Pamplona, and the town is featured in The Sun Also Rises. Leo pointed out several front doors where dried sunflowers had been artfully placed, and explained that this was an old Basque superstition to repel dark spirits, the sunflower representing light. The Camino wove in and out of forests and small towns all morning, each town as charming as the last. We passed a few horses and many cows, some of whom had escaped their paddocks and roamed aimlessly along the trail. Rugged hills surrounded the pastures, pretty, but tamer than yesterday's mountainous terrain. Clouds blew in and out, and a few sprinkles appeared mid-morning, but the sky remained mostly bright and dry. After lunch and a short bus transfer, we reached Pamplona in the afternoon. We stopped outside the 16th century city walls, where we picked up the Camino again and followed the trail through the city gates and into the old town, where the trail was marked by metal scallop markers embedded in the pavement. After going to the Albergue Jesus y Maria to get our credencials stamped, Leo led us on a walking tour which focused mainly on the San Fermin festival and its famous running of the bulls. We located the pen where the bulls are held each July and followed the bulls' route all the way to the bull ring, with Leo and Eric giving frequent commentary on the craziness of San Fermin. At the bull ring, the main entrance was surprisingly open, and a reluctant guard finally allowed us inside for a quick peek, an unexpected treat. Outside the bull ring stood a bust of Ernest Hemingway, and Leo commented that Pamplona really owed him much more than that, since The Sun Also Rises pretty much put Pamplona on the international map. Afterward, we ambled to the delightful Plaza del Castillo, where we sat al fresco at Cafe Iruna. Over drinks, Eric gave a lengthy and impassioned discussion about bullfighting. Drinking a cold beer and watching the world go by in the late afternoon sun at Cafe Iruna was a little slice of heaven. In fact, the whole of Pamplona seemed lovely. And before we left, we went inside the cafe to a downstairs lounge to pose with a life-size bronze Hemingway leaning appropriately against the bar. Day 3. Love and faith come together. Justice and peace join hands. This route took us from Pamplona to the high plains of central Spain known as La Meseta. The morning was a cool, dull gray with threatening skies, but our itinerary called for a 2-hour bus transfer to our trailhead for the day, which allowed time for reflection as I watched the countryside go past my window. The journal continues. This stretch of the Camino pretty much follows the highway, and we passed hundreds of pilgrims making their way along a path not 20 yards from the rushing traffic under a cloudy sky. This would not have been a particularly pleasant stretch to walk, and as we passed the pilgrims, I wondered what motivated them to make this difficult and not always scenic journey. We'd run across lots of young people carrying full backpacks, and maybe some of them were in it for the adventure of backpacking across Spain on a well-marked and a well-serviced trail. Perhaps others were driven by the physical and mental challenge of a 500-mile, 6-week trek. But surely others, like ourselves, were called to the Camino, at least in part, for spiritual reasons, to walk in the footsteps of faithful pilgrims who, for 1,200 years, have made this journey under conditions far more difficult than anything we could imagine, and in so doing, feeling the presence of God. Certainly, people of all ages, of all nationalities, and in all kinds of physical condition participated in the Pilgrim's Mass in Roncesvalles, where the Salve Regina was sung so authentically. Our first task upon reaching our kickoff point was to ascend the flank of a hill named Matapuerca, a steady uphill climb on a trail that was pretty rocky, even becoming limestone bedrock by the time we reached the summit. Wildflowers seemed more plentiful now that we were in open countryside. And while the rocks made the walking a little difficult, the views from the higher ground were sublime, extending for tens of miles across bright green, early spring wheat fields. At the summit, we found a cross, maybe 25 feet tall, with hundreds of stones placed around the base by pilgrims as they had passed. Some were inscribed. Merrick, for example, declared, "J'ai découvert le courage," I discovered courage, and a few rocks held down prayers written on paper. 100 yards down the path, we discovered a huge surprise. In a flat open space was a very large labyrinth, which had been constructed out of stones. We, of course, had no time to walk it, but were amazed to find one there out in the middle of nowhere. But maybe we shouldn't have been. Walking a labyrinth is a metaphorical journey, entirely appropriate to the Camino. As we started our descent, I lagged behind to take photos of the magnificent views, and I heard footsteps behind me that paused thoughtfully as I crouched to frame a shot. And when I arose and turned around, I found a pilgrim behind me with a full backpack. He was a tall, older gentleman, probably in his 70s, Bob, from Hampshire, England. And we fell into conversation as we continued down the trail. He'd been hiking for about 2 weeks, having started at St. John, and reckoned that he had another 3 or 4 weeks left. We talked about his experience as a pilgrim so far, the food, the Refugios, how his body was holding up. And then I asked him what had drawn him to the Camino. He explained that he hiked every summer in the Austrian Alps, staying in the same pension year after year, and that he and his partner had talked many times about walking the Camino, but she had died in 2014, and so he was walking it for the two of them. Then he asked me if I had seen the movie The Way, which of course I had, and he confided that, as in the movie, he had brought her ashes and was spreading them along the Camino as he progressed. It was a very touching moment, profound, really. And I wondered how many stories were being carried by our fellow pilgrims. We had passed hundreds and hundreds of them, and each must have been carrying some story, large or small, in their heart. We then pushed on under a perfect blue sky, ending up along the Rio Arlanzon, which led us into Burgos, the historical capital of Castile, being strategically situated between Madrid and the Cantabrian Mountains. At first, the river trail was bucolic, but after a few miles, it took on the character of a city park. There was still no sign of urbanization, but the dirt path had turned into paved walking and biking lanes, and street lamps appeared, as did the occasional jogger and cyclist. It was a very pleasant way to enter the city, which we reached after another hour and a half, with the towers of Burgos Cathedral finally coming into sight, soaring above the willows along the river. We had covered just under 14 miles. After cleaning up a bit in our rather spectacular hotel, a converted 16th century building, we met our guide, Gloria, who led us through the Disneyland-like city gate for a tour of the cathedral. Gloria was quirky, dark-haired and energetic, with a husky voice and an expressive face. Her English was very good, but sometimes she used odd expressions, which, combined with her energy, her heavy accent, and her mannerisms, gave her a slightly eccentric vibe. But she knew her stuff, and there's nothing quirky about Burgos Cathedral, a masterpiece of Spanish Gothic architecture. Built between 1221 and 1567 of creamy native limestone, it fairly glowed in the late afternoon sun. Its intricate and ornate stone carving gave it a delicate and yet solid and majestic feel. And the interior was utterly spectacular. The limestone had been recently cleaned, and the nave and ceiling just glowed with warm light. A highly decorated dome soared above the crossing, beneath which were the tombs of Rodrigo Diaz de Vivar, better known as El Cid, and his wife Jimena. Several side chambers were equally spectacular, especially the octagonal Capilla del Condestable, where 15th century nobleman Pedro Fernandez de Velasco and his wife Mencia are buried in the style, I'm pretty sure, to which they had become accustomed. That evening, we dined in a restaurant directly across from the cathedral's front facade. It was after 10 p.m. when the meal ended, but I lingered a bit. It was a perfect Maxfield Parish twilight with an incredibly rich blue sky complemented by warm evening lamplight. Pausing to admire the cathedral one last time, I continued through the city gate and past the pollarded plane trees along the riverside esplanade. It could not have been prettier. Day 4. This is the day that God has made. We will rejoice and be glad in it. This day would be our longest hike of the trip at 16.5 miles as we continued across La Meseta. Mercifully, the terrain was almost completely flat, but despite the lack of majestic scenery, this particular morning provided two of the most interesting encounters of the trip. Firstly, there was an almost comical effort to organize payment for a Botafumeiro at Santiago Cathedral. Now, I'll explain in a few minutes what a Botafumeiro is and why arranging it was important to us. But before we get to that story, this morning provided one of the most spiritual moments of the entire trip. Some of you may be familiar with the concept of a thin place. Rooted particularly in the Celtic Christian tradition, a thin place is a physical location where the boundary between heaven and earth is especially narrow. It's a place where people experience God more closely. But I'll let my journal describe it in more detail. Wildflowers greeted us almost immediately as we left town, especially daisies, margaritas in Spanish, and bright red poppies. We stopped to admire one lone poppy along the trail as we left town, which had a perfectly shaped cross in its center, as if to signal encouragement to passing pilgrims. Walking beside lovely stands of poplar trees as the fog lifted, we soon picked up the Canal de Castilla, a pleasant surprise. The canal had been built in the late 18th and early 19th century to transport grain to markets, but was soon overtaken by railroads as the preferred export route and was then converted to irrigation. The Camino followed the old towpath for several miles, and as we made our way, the air was filled with birdsong and croaking frogs, which, coupled with the wildflowers and incredibly green wheat fields, evoked total immersion in the natural world. It made me think of the ancient Celtic Christians and their belief in the essential goodness of creation. Often living in wild places at the very edge of the known world, their radical intimacy with nature brought them closer to God. Such locales have come to be known as thin places where the boundary between heaven and earth is especially sheer. And in fact, while we would see far more splendid and ecclesiastical sites along the Camino, this morning on the Canal de Castilla felt to me as much like a thin place as anywhere else we visited. Speaking of a Mass at Santiago Cathedral on our last night of the pilgrimage. Eric had made some inquiries on our part and had figured out what we needed to do to make this happen. After the lovely walk along the canal, we entered the town of Fromista, where we could start putting the plan into motion. The key element was that we had to make a financial contribution to the cathedral, but this could only be done in advance, in cash, and usually by wire transfer. But Eric had determined that we could make a deposit directly into a cathedral account, which made the transaction simpler. So, while the rest of our party went to a cafe for a rest break, Eric and I went to the local branch of Santander Bank to make our deposit. Eric explained what we needed to do to the young lady on duty, and he gave her the account information. But the lady started arguing with Eric, and the conversation got a little testy. Finally, things were squared away. I paid my money, and the deposit was made. Upon leaving the bank, Eric told me that the clerk had wanted to charge us €3 to make a deposit. She argued, as far as I could tell, that if we were making a deposit instead of wiring money, we should still pay a fee as if the money was being wired. Eric was beside himself. How could a bank charge someone who just wanted to make a deposit into a customer's account? Meanwhile, Kaki and the other pilgrims had been admiring the lovely Romanesque church of San Martin and otherwise enjoying their morning. After lunch, we continued down our rural road under a brilliant sky. I walked alone behind our group to enjoy the solitude and to admire the simple but beautiful scenery. Gentle breezes created waves across the young wheat, giving the illusion of moving water, and wildflowers continued to line our path for much of the way. At 3 o'clock, we stopped briefly at Villafranca for a break in the shadow of its ruined Romanesque church, then pushed on to a monastery, our final destination, reaching it by 4:30. This would be the longest day of our trip at 16.5 miles, and we were all tired. And though the landscape was less spectacular than what we had seen on previous days, I had enjoyed the walk immensely. The day had been just about perfect weather-wise, and the wildflowers and tidy wheat fields were a joy to behold. Day 5. Open our lips, O God, and our mouths shall proclaim praise. This was our last day in La Meseta, and we completed our 12 hours before lunch, or 12 miles before lunch. The highlight of the day, however, was León and its magnificent cathedral. The journal continues. We rejoined the Camino at El Burgo Ranero, again finding a flat dirt track following a paved country road. A row of plane trees bounded the trail on the left for the first several miles, and wildflowers also abounded. But two things made this morning's walk distinct from yesterday. The Cantabrian Mountains, which were now clearly visible on the northern horizon, and magnificent cumulus cloud formations that, coupled with the open fields, gave a big sky feel to the walk. We could have been walking among the wheat fields of eastern Colorado with the Rockies on the horizon some 40 miles distant. After lunch, the bus took us to Leon, where our local guide, Blanca, met us for a brief tour of Leon Cathedral. Though smaller than its rival in Burgos, Leon's cathedral's distinction is its stained glass. One of the most extensive displays in Europe, according to Blanca. It's second only to Chartres, and the majority of it is original to the 13th through the 15th centuries. Eric pressed Blanca for time as we were all pretty tired, and Blanca responded admirably and in 30 minutes gave an exceptionally lucid and concise explanation of Gothic architecture in general and Leon's in particular, as well as the significance of the stained glass panels. It was a pretty impressive performance. And the beauty of the stained glass just took our breath away. Because the back wall of the choir area in the nave had been replaced by a huge glass panel early in the 20th century, the nave seemed particularly spacious and airy. It was something like being in Sainte-Chapelle in Paris, only 10 times larger. It was a gem, and so was Blanca. Kaki and I left the group with Leo, following the Camino through the old town. The Camino literally ran from the cathedral back to our parador to clean up and rest. Kaki had a massage booked for 6 p.m., and I just wanted to relax and sit on our lovely balcony and catch up on my journaling. We were both tiring after 5 days and 60 plus miles, and everything hurt. Day 6. If Christ's disciples keep silent, these stones would shout aloud. Today's walk in blustery conditions led us to Astorga, with the Cantabrian Mountains looming. The journal continues. It had rained overnight and was still spitting down the occasional drop from a gray sky when I went into the plaza in front of the parador shortly after 7 a.m. The air had turned cooler too. A few pilgrims with full backpacks groggily made their way across the plaza, and they were bundled up in jackets and stocking caps. One or two pilgrims stopped briefly to contemplate a pilgrim statue near the parador's main entrance, then quickly moved on, intent on their mission. After a 30-minute ride, we arrived at our trailhead, the old Roman bridge over the Rio Orbigo, known as La Puente del Paso Honoroso. Legend holds that in 1434, a knight, honoring a pledge he had made to his fair maiden, stood guard on the bridge for a solid month, challenging anyone wishing to cross to a joust, and he apparently defeated all comers. It was an amazing bridge spanning perhaps 200 yards across the wide riverbed, made all the more beautiful by the crisp morning light. The wind had picked up and it was now quite blustery, perhaps in the 50s, but feeling cooler. We took a few minutes to bundle up and then crossed the bridge into the hamlet of Hospital de Orbigo on the far side of the river. Mercifully, the Camino had broken free of the rural highways that had accompanied it in recent days, and we were now walking down a dirt road leading out of town, free of traffic. There were alternating periods of cloud and sun, but the wind was pretty steady. After an hour of pleasant walking, we entered a small town, Sant Ibanez de Valdeiglesias, for a coffee break. Many of the towns we had walked through recently had seemed somewhat void of activity, but Sant Ibanez felt a little more lively on this bright Sunday morning. Next door to our coffee spot, a little old village lady stood in her doorway and seemed to be giving directions to other pilgrims. After 2 hours, we topped a hill and were treated to a wonderful view of the Cantabrian Mountains, which still had patches of snow on their summits. The wind was coming from their direction, the north, which seemed to explain why it was so chill. In another 20 minutes, we reached Vista de Astorga, a huge cross on a hilltop offering spectacular views of Astorga and the mountains beyond. As elsewhere, pilgrims had left stones at its base, some with comments or just names. We paused briefly, then started downhill towards Astorga with the twin towers of its cathedral dominating the skyline. The wind was really blowing now, Patagonia scale, and I struggled to keep my hat in place, even with the drawstring cinched tightly. An hour later, we entered the old town and continued through delightful little squares full of people on this bright Sunday afternoon. We lunched across the street from the cathedral in a lively restaurant where a large family was celebrating a young girl's confirmation, then went back outside to admire the facade of the cathedral in the warm afternoon sun before driving to Villafranca del Bierzo for the night. And the Spirit enable you to grow in love. We re-entered mountainous terrain as we were approaching Galicia. The walks were shorter, but steeper, and the atmosphere changed too. It was more mystical somehow, and surprisingly Celtic. The journal continues. It was cool, even chilly, when we left our parador, and I donned my fleece for the first time. Our first stop was to visit the 13th century Church of Santiago the Apostle in Villafranca, with its famous Puerta del Perdón, the forgiveness store. As Villafranca was the last stop on the Camino before entering the rugged countryside of Galicia, it proved to be the end of the journey for some pilgrims who were physically unable to manage the mountainous final stretch. The Pope therefore allowed that in these cases, a special dispensation could be granted so that these pilgrims could be considered to have successfully completed their pilgrimage. This dispensation was granted through the forgiveness store. While we heard this story, a few pilgrims drifted by. We then shuttled to Herrerias, the starting point of our walk, and after a quick coffee, we walked through the sleepy town, which sat along a lovely mountain stream. We began by walking up a paved country lane, but soon veered off into a dirt path through some woods, steadily climbing. After about 30 minutes, we made a brief stop at La Faba, a hamlet perched on a hillside, to visit its well-known church. Its sanctuary was plain, as would be expected in a country church, I suppose, with stone walls and a wood ceiling. The two transepts, however, contained shrines of Jesus and the Virgin Mary, each with crosses formed by votive candles on the floor in front of them, rendering the church serene. The countryside opened up as we continued our ascent. High clouds blocked the brunt of the sun and kept the temperatures down, making it pleasant to be out. Wildflowers adorned the path and the open meadows, and increasingly we got nice views back down the valley whence we came and to the mountains beyond. Low stone walls started to appear along the path that were very reminiscent of those we saw last summer on the island of Inishmore in Ireland. And sure enough, we soon reached a little roadside albergue where Celtic music was playing out on its patio. As we would soon see, Celtic influence in Galicia was strong. Just after noon, we reached the border crossing from Castilla y León to Galicia, a significant milestone marking the entry into the Camino's final stage. Shortly thereafter, we walked into the mountaintop village of O Sobrero, our destination for the day. We had only walked 6 miles, our shortest hike of the trip, but we had climbed more than 2,400 feet and were now at an elevation of 4,000 feet. It's hard to overstate how different O Sobrero was from the many villages we had traversed in the previous few days. All of the buildings were made of stone and mostly had slate roofs, although there were some with thatched roofs, all lining cobblestone streets. It looked more like Ireland or Cornwall than Spain. A little touristy, it was full of pilgrims, many relaxing at outside cafes on this fine day as wood smoke drifted in the air. One of the main features of O Sobrero is the oldest church on the entire Camino, Santa Maria la Real do O Sobrero, dating from the 10th century. A low, squat stone building with few windows and a short belfry. It was among the first things we saw when we entered the village. The nave and sanctuary were whitewashed with stone accents below a vaulted wood ceiling, and red prayer candles glowed under a shrine, adding to the peaceful and sacred ambiance. On prominent display was a chalice associated with a miracle dating from 1300. Legend holds that in that year, a Benedictine priest was holding Mass on an icy winter day and did not expect anyone to show up, but a faithful local farmer did. Now, the priest did not believe in the real presence of Christ in the sacrament, but during the Eucharist, the bread turned to flesh and the wine to blood. Some 200 years later, Queen Isabella learned about the miracle while visiting the church on a pilgrimage to Santiago and ordered a crystal shrine to hold the chalice. We lunched in a small inn with low ceilings and a wood fire burning in the corner. It really did feel more British than Spanish. 2 ladies seemed to be running the place and served up a simple and hearty meal, topped off by a local specialty for dessert, a homemade soft cheese drizzled with dark honey. After lunch, we lingered a bit, wandering in and out of shops, and then drove to our destination for the night, Lugo. Day 8. Give us again the joy of your help. With your spirit of freedom, sustain us. And so we reached the final leg into Santiago. Paradoxically, this was the least interesting and yet most intense segment. Since much of it was walking through the outskirts and then into central Santiago, it was the most mundane landscape that we encountered. But on the other hand, it was the most profound emotionally, especially as we got closer and closer to the cathedral and the culmination of our journey. The journal continues. Rain beat steadily against the bust windshield as we drove down the highway. The sky had been gray but bright when we left Lugo, with even a hint of sunshine here and there. But as we drove deeper into Galicia, the rainiest region of Spain, the clouds closed in. And when we stopped in Pedruso to start our final trek, a soft spring rain was falling. Geared up for the wet, we headed down a bare path into some woods. The rain kept falling, but not too heavily. Kaki commented that it seemed appropriate to end our pilgrimage with a rainy day, because having at least a little rain made our Camino experience seem more complete. Perhaps even more importantly, she said, the rain seemed to dampen conversation and encourage introspection as we progressed toward our final destination. At one point, we passed a chain-link fence along the Camino where pilgrims had affixed makeshift crosses made of twigs, literally dozens of them, as if one pilgrim had started it, and everyone else then followed suit as they passed by. Kaki and I headed into town on our own, ahead of the group, sensing the home stretch. The Camino followed a highway into town, then through some rather ordinary landscape of nondescript buildings. We kept a close lookout for Camino signs to guide us, fearing a wrong turn. And oddly, the closer we got, the more obscure the signs seemed to be. And after a seemingly interminable trek through this unremarkable urban scenery, we finally entered the old town with its narrow, cobbled streets. Eric had told us that you don't really see the cathedral until you're right in front of it. And this is pretty much true. We only got the barest glimpses of a cathedral spire as we continued down the narrow lanes of Old Town, anxiously anticipating the cathedral and sensing that it was very near. We turned a corner and found ourselves in a plaza in front of an impressive 17th century facade with lots of people milling about. We stopped in our tracks, looked up in awe, and thought, this must be it. We hugged each other to mark the end of our pilgrimage, only to be interrupted by a young lady passing by who smiled and said in a New Zealand accent, I don't want to spoil your special moment, but this isn't the cathedral. It's another 200 meters ahead. We were actually in the Plaza de la Immaculada, admiring the Monasterio de San Martino Pinario. Laughing at our faux pas, we continued downhill through a high tunnel leading into the real plaza, Plaza del Obradoro. A Galician bagpiper struck up his instrument in the tunnel just as we passed, and we entered the plaza to the strains of his plaintive Celtic tune. The plaza was in. It was laughable that we had mistaken the tiny plaza just uphill for the real thing now that we saw it. The cathedral, which was just off to our left as we entered, dominated the scene with its two bell towers and massive facade that ran the entire width of the plaza. Impressive 17th or 18th century buildings formed the other three sides. We just stood in amazement at the sight, tired but filled with excitement in the realization that we were able to complete our pilgrimage, and watching with a knowing empathy the expressions of other pilgrims as they too entered the plaza with the awareness that they had finished their long journey, a scene that surely has been repeated daily for centuries, even a millennium. Emma was there in front of the parador to greet us and to deliver our room key, but we wanted to wait for our fellow pilgrims to arrive along with our guides, which they did over the next 15 minutes. And we all hugged each other in congratulations. And so we had completed the walking portion of the pilgrimage, covering 96 miles on the Camino itself and easily another 10 miles or so in various city tours along the way. Not surprisingly, I suppose, our bodies had adjusted to the rigors of the walk, and while we were tired from the cumulative effort, things didn't seem to hurt the way they had 3 or 4 days into the walk. We dropped into bed after 10:30 that night and slept the sleep of the righteous. The Pilgrim's Mass. Go in peace to love and serve. We will seek peace and pursue it. The culmination of the pilgrimage for many pilgrims is the Pilgrim's Mass, held every evening at Santiago Cathedral. And a special feature of the Mass is the Botafumeiro, shown here. Botafumeiro is a Galician term meaning smoke expeller, and it's an enormous incense censer suspended over the crossing that is skillfully manipulated in such a way that it swings in a huge arc across the transepts of the cathedral. At least it does this on some nights. In order for the Botafumeiro to be performed, there must be a sponsor for that particular Mass, meaning someone has to make a financial contribution to the cathedral. Kaki and I wanted badly to see it and were reluctant to take the chance that someone else would step up to the plate. So we became the sponsors for our Mass, which is why Eric had to haggle with that bank clerk back in Fromista. The journal continues. I returned to the cathedral at 6:30 for the 7:30's Pilgrims Mass to ensure a good seat, though, as it turned out, I hadn't needed to. While I waited, I had the chance to admire the nave, the crossing, the sanctuary, and to reflect not only on our journey, but on the many thousands of pilgrims who had sat in this very spot after their sojourn over many centuries. What a thrill it was to be part of something so grand, so historic, so meaningful to so many people. The rest of our group arrived shortly after 7, and Eric ushered Kaki and me over to the west transept, where, as sponsors of that evening's Fumero, a front row pew had been reserved for us. Toward the close of the Mass, I noticed several red-robed men called tirabuleros off to my right as they approached the crossing, carrying a load of burning charcoal. Other tirabuleros retrieved the rope in the other transept, slowly lowering the Botafumero from its resting place some 30 feet above the crossing to the ground where, to a magnificent fanfare blaring from the organ, it was loaded with its sweet cargo. And after a blessing by the priest, the tirabuleros manning the ropes gave a heave, and the Botafumero bobbed straight up and down to the beautiful strains of a hymn sung by a nun. And before we knew it, the Botafumeiro was at rest back on the ground, and the Mass was over. Eric wiped the tear from his eye and commented to us that he had heard this nun sing before and how moved he was by the beauty of her voice. And as the crowd began to disperse, he went up to her and expressed his appreciation. After dinner, again in the Parador's spectacular dining room, we all said our goodbyes, and I wandered out into the plaza for one last look in the late twilight. Even after 10 p.m., there were many people about, and I just tried to soak it all in, the grandeur of the plaza, of course, but also our journey. We did not walk the entire 500 miles, but we did cover nearly 100 and came to know something of the rigors as well as the joys of Camino life. Further, although we didn't qualify for a Compostela, we did get to experience the geographical breadth of the Camino from the high Pyrenees and the Basque country through La Meseta to the Cantabrian Mountains, Galicia, and Santiago. We were also privileged to have had guided tours at special sites, Burgos Cathedral, for example, that would not have been available to an ordinary pilgrim. There were the expected highlights, like the views from the high mountain pass in the Pyrenees, but unexpected treasures too, as simple as a solitary red poppy in a green wheat field. And each day was different, bringing something new, sometimes a challenge to be overcome, other times a chance encounter with a complete stranger that shook my perspective. Joyce Rupp, in her book, Walk in a Relaxed Manner, equates daily life to a pilgrimage, and like life itself, the Camino was usually delightful, but not always. Sometimes predictable, but prone to the unforeseen. We had been reminded that some things in life are knowable and others are not, at least in the cognitive sense, but are real nonetheless, and that the beauty in life is often right there in front of us if we can only tune out the fleeting distractions of the day. The Camino affirmed to me that we are pilgrims in life, and each day we take to the road. After a few minutes, I turned to head back into the Parador, and I ran into Eric coming out. I told him again how special this trip had been for us and how much we had appreciated his expert guiding. We shook hands. Then, after a second or two, he gave me a hug around the shoulders and walked off across the plaza.
Thank you so much.
And that's my story, and I'm sticking with it.
Sticking to it. Thank you so much, Kent. That was absolutely wonderful. You are such a wonderful writer and a profound writer, and the combination of your recollections and your journaling combined just made a very powerful presentation. I think we speak for all of us that we thought we were on the Camino with you.
Well,
although my feet don't feel it, but certainly my spirit does, and capturing the sights and sounds and feelings along the way. Thank you so much for that.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. Thank you for your kind comments. So perhaps we should invite Eric now to add his reflections, because
exactly.
I only did 100. Eric did all 500, as I understand.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of similarities, but also the 500 miles made a difference. I went with my youngest daughter. I got some extra time off from the church I was serving in Georgetown in Washington. You went at a probably better time of year. We did this from June 30th to August 1st. So we did the 500 miles in 33 days. That meant walking every day.
Yeah.
It also meant that we were doing it when it was incredibly hot. I mean, walking across Rioja and Castilla, it was 90s every day. So it meant that we were getting up in the dark and walking as early as we could, just so we could finish by 2 o'clock in the afternoon.
Right.
It's too hot after that. One of the things that I think I really came away with was that there's an awful lot of Canterbury tales to the way that this actually goes, more than you might guess, because you tend to walk about the same pace as groups of other people, certain groups of other people. There were, Northern Europeans tended to join together because they could all speak English. The French refused to learn Spanish, so they were with us. The Italians and the Spanish could understand each other, so they were walking together. And the interesting thing about it was, you talk to them, you'd break away, but what really made the trip, because it was so physically demanding. I mean, your feet were just torn up. You will get blisters. But it was absolutely amazing the help that they all gave each other.
Yes.
In terms of directions, in terms of how to treat blisters. One afternoon, my knee just went out, and I have no idea what it was. Some guy gave me his knee brace till we got into the next town where I could buy one. One night, we were staying in the albergues, and one night, Elspeth and I ended up with another guy from Hungary, with a Spanish guy affectionately known as Carlos the Snorer. And the guy from Hungary had plenty of earplugs, and he passed them out to all of the rest of us so that we could in fact make it through the night. And it was all sorts of small things like that, of people helping each other. And the interesting thing was that, as in that movie, The Way, nobody knew anything about the other person except their first name and where they were from.
Yes.
So it was, Carlos from Madrid. It was Joop from Amsterdam.
Right.
And we knew we'd never see each other again, probably. Some people may have, but it was this incredible camaraderie and help that they gave each other. And at the end of it, I ended up preaching a sermon on the workers in the vineyard, and I'll maybe do that for you someday, but it expressed perfectly, what the experience was. And I got real insight into the parable.
Right.
Thank you, Eric. And I'm glad you brought up the movie The Way again, as Kent had indicated during his presentation. If you haven't seen it, it's really worth a film worth seeing. It's stars Martin Sheen, and it's about his experience along with others with him along the Camino, and what started as a sort of a people didn't had all sorts of things going on in their lives, and were making this this trip for various reasons. How the Camino then transformed the walking, the journey, into a very much a spiritual and religious pilgrimage, and it's really worth watching if you can find
And
it.
I would say, for being able to reduce it to an hour and a half, they really got the flavor of it.
Yeah.
Other than how much your feet hurt. They didn't talk about that enough.
I think it's available on most streaming platforms, so do look for. It's called The Way. It's I forget when it came out. Probably in the late '90s, early.
No, it actually we went in 2010, and he filmed it that fall.
Oh, okay, good. That's good to
So I
know.
think it came out in 2011.
2010, 2011. All right.
Yeah, we watched it for the first time in a long time, a couple of evenings ago, and it was so much fun to see certain places like Osabrero or Saint Jean Pied de Port or Burgos Cathedral, or even a certain Parador, the Parador in Leon, where they splurged and they all stayed in splendid rooms for the night. That's the Parador in Leon. It was fun to see these little visuals of what we had seen, but that whole sense of as Eric was saying, of kind of camaraderie, because I can just imagine groups of people all going at a similar pace and walking and you have to, there are certain places where you essentially have to stop, I think, because that's where the albergues are, the refugios, and you can't go another 3 or 4 miles necessarily. So people do tend to kind of go in groups, not intentionally, but it just works out that way.
Are there any questions for Kent or for Eric?
Could I ask Kent and Eric, did you find in your journey, Kent, you were with an organized group. Were there people within your group who were treating it as a spiritual journey from the beginning, or did people just sort of discover that along the way? And I guess, Eric, you were sort of forming groups randomly along the way, weren't you? So how many people, what percentage were treating it as a strictly secular journey, and what were treating it as a spiritual journey?
That's an interesting question. In our case, there were 8 of us were in our pilgrimage group, and so of course Kaki and I were treating it as a spiritual as well as a physical endeavor. There was a family of 3, a husband and a wife and a sister of the wife, who were devout Catholics. So I think they were treating it, as in that spiritual dimension as well. And they're the ones, for example, that told me that, well, what they were singing at Roncesvalles was the Salve Regina. And we had a discussion about how come we couldn't go to the altar and receive a sacrament, because only Catholics were allowed to. So I think they were certainly approaching it from a spiritual place as well. The other folks, I think, was probably more of a mixture, but certainly there was a single lady that we walked with, and interestingly, Kaki and I were trying to discern whether or not to move to Santa Fe while we were walking the Camino. That was one of our big issues of the moment, and this single lady who was in her 70s was walking, and she had connections from Santa Fe, and in fact she comes every summer, and we still see her every time she comes to town. So we've maintained that relationship, but I'd say it was a mixture. I think some more than others.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, there were a lot of young people there, and it was their summer vacation, and so they were going to do this. A lot of middle-aged people from Europe. There actually were not many Americans on it. A lot of middle-aged people from Europe who were doing it as a summer vacation, as a hike. But there were an awful lot of people who were doing it as a spiritual journey. I met a priest from Germany and became very good friends with him. And those people could collect each other. And there was one little Romanesque chapel sort of in the middle of nowhere, right before Atapuerca. And I remember he and I and a young Polish woman went in there and started singing Taizé chant in parts, because the acoustics were just wonderful. I mean, it was a terrific experience. So yeah, people were doing it as a spiritual matter, and by walking it, pretty much every town you came into, at least of any size, had a mass every night.
Right.
Now, I will note, you ran into the priest at Roncesvalles, and he told everybody, no, if you're not Catholic, you can't do it. It really varied across the Camino. I think you could tell what the bishop was like in that particular diocese by the
Right.
direction he got. And frankly, I just said, I work for the same guy. I got different directions. So, I said, come unto me, all ye who are weary and heavy laden. I said, I'm there.
You fit the bill. Yeah, especially on the Camino.
Well, it's interesting to, in preparing for the talk, I fished out a couple of things. I fished out my credenzial. So, here's that. But I also fished out the list of countries that were represented in Roncesvalles that Mercedes had given me at the end of the Mass. And it's interesting when you look at there's the usual suspects of Germany, Austria, Belgium, Denmark, and so forth. But there were Australians there that night, Koreans, Japanese, South Africans, Brazilians, Argentinians, and Colombians, Mexicans, and us Americans. So I mean, it's a pretty diverse and worldwide, group that were there on that particular night, and I don't imagine that we were unusual in that regard.
Hmm.
No, the year we went was actually a St. James year, which is when the Feast of St. James, which is July 25th, falls on a Sunday. So if you're getting credit, if you're getting indulgences, as the Catholics did, you get double. So in fact, there were even more people
Right.
during that entire time.
Are there other questions for Kent or for Eric?
No, but one of our members, Susan Weber, went about 3 years ago. And in fact, she had a foot operation the year previous so she could walk. I don't know, it was weeks. I don't know how long it was, but she had a terrific experience with her family. Her son, I believe, lives in Spain. And she had a terrific experience.
Well, we had hoped that we would do this live in Palin Hall at the church with our new audio visual system in place. And because of the masking requirements and all, we thought that it was probably more prudent to do this via Zoom. The good thing is that by doing it via Zoom today, we were able to record this. The recording capability in Palin Hall is not engaged yet. It actually will be in the next week or so. So we were trying to scramble to get this done by today at the recording, and it wasn't going to happen. We still need a few more parts that haven't come in, but this has been recorded, and it will be uploaded to the Holy Faith website, the YouTube channel for Holy Faith, and so I encourage you to tell your friends that they can go to the website and see this and watch this and hear this marvelous presentation. And the library committee expects to do more library talks. We've got some in the works, whether they're via Zoom or whether they're live in Palin Hall, live in the library, remains to be seen. So stay tuned for coming announcements for that. And do remember that Kent's book, Each Day We Take to the Road, which is the opening line of the French Pilgrims song that Kent mentioned. His book with the wonderful photographs and all is in the library, and you can come in and take a look at that and enjoy, again, at your leisure, without all the footsteps, walking the Camino to Santiago. Kent, our great thanks to you. Again, you just have a real gift for how to present these pilgrimages, as you did earlier for the library to Jerusalem, and now to to Santiago, and I can't wait for you to take your next pilgrimage so that we can do another one of these.
Well, as soon as we get past COVID, we'll look at doing something else.
Sounds good. Sounds good. Thank you all for joining in. It's been a pleasure, and look forward to seeing you either in person or via Zoom as soon as possible. God bless everyone.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.